All right, today we're diving deep into a scholarly revolution. This is a wild story about our whole understanding of ancient history got flipped on its head, not because of some new archaeological dig, but by taking a closer look at a single, super controversial phrase buried right in the book of Deuteronomy.
This is it. These are the words right here. The place which the Lord your God shall choose. I mean, at first glance, it seems pretty simple, right? A command about where to worship. And for centuries, everyone kind of read it the same way. But then, in the 19th century, scholars started seeing it differently, and they basically lit a fuse that would blow up 1,000 years of tradition.
It sounds like a total exaggeration, doesn't it? Could one phrase really do all that? But honestly, that's pretty much what happened. This one line became the master key to unlocking a radical, totally new timeline for the Old Testament. So let's jump into this scholarly detective story.
Okay, so let's get into the specifics of this phrase. To really get what's at stake here, you have to understand just how important this one line became. This wasn't just another verse for scholars to argue about. For a whole school of thought, this was the absolute center of the entire puzzle.
As the Dutch scholar Halwarda put it, this phrase is the root problem. He wasn't kidding. He argued that how you interpret this line from Deuteronomy 12 became the launchpad for a completely new and way more critical way of reading the Bible. So we're not talking about some minor academic squabble. This was a full-blown earthquake.
Now here's what's so fascinating. You've got the critical German scholar Julius Wellhausen on one side, and more traditional Bible scholars on the other. And you'd think they disagree on everything, right? But look at this. They actually agreed on what Deuteronomy 12 says. Both said, yep, this is a command to worship at one single central place. The debate wasn't over the what. The explosive part, the part that changed everything, was the when.
And that brings us to the guy at the epicenter of this whole thing, Julius Wellhausen. He came forward with this theory that Israel's religion didn't just pop into existence, fully formed with Moses. No, he argued that it evolved over centuries, and the laws about where to worship, that was his Exhibit A.
So Wellhausen laid out these three distinct stages. First, you got this early period, the time of the judges and Samuel, where having lots of different altars was totally normal and accepted. Then, around 621 BC, you get this big push for reform under King Josiah, trying to centralize all worship in Jerusalem. And finally, after the Babylonian exile, the idea of just one sanctuary becomes the standard, undisputed norm.
And here's where it gets really clever. Wellhausen argued that the legal codes in the Bible perfectly match these three historical stages. It's kind of brilliant. Step 1, you look at the law in Exodus 20, and hey, it allows for multiple altars. That fits his early era. Step 2, boom, there's our key text, Deuteronomy 12, arguing for one place. That slots right into Josiah's reform. And finally, Step 3, the later priestly code just assumes one sanctuary is normal. It doesn't even bother to argue for it. It's an incredibly neat and tidy package.
So let's just pause and think about what this really means. Wellhausen's theory completely flips the biblical timeline on its head. In the traditional view, you start with Moses and the law, and the prophets are the ones calling people back to it. But in Wellhausen's world, you start with ancient heathenism, and the prophets aren't preservationists, they're radical innovators pushing Israel towards something new. The law of Moses isn't the foundation, it's the final capstone on a long, long process.
Okay, so that's the theory. It's powerful, it's elegant, but like with any grand theory, the evidence on the ground can get a little messy. If Deuteronomy's law against multiple altars really came from Moses, then why do the historical books seem to be full of heroes of the faith who are completely ignoring it? Let's get into the counter-investigation.
Take the prophet Elijah, for instance. He's at rock bottom, hiding in a cave, and he complains to God that the people have thrown down your altars. See that? Altars, plural. He isn't lamenting the destruction of just one altar in Jerusalem. He's talking about multiple, apparently legitimate altars to the Lord that have been torn down.
The case of the prophet Samuel is even more striking. I mean, this guy is one of Israel's greatest reformers, and the text just casually shows him offering sacrifices all over the place. At Ramah, Mizpah, Gilgal. And get this, God even tells him to use a sacrifice in Bethlehem as a cover story for a secret mission, which suggests the practice was so normal nobody would even bat an eye. And the evidence just keeps piling up with David himself. His family had a yearly sacrifice back in their hometown of Bethlehem. Later, when his son Absalom is plotting a rebellion, what's his cover story? He asks King David, hey, can I go to Hebron to offer a sacrifice and pay a vow? And David just says, go in peace. These things are treated as totally routine, not as some illegal violation of a foundational law.
So, what gives? We've got a command that seems crystal clear, and then we have all these biblical heroes who seem to be just ignoring it. Well, this brings us to the core of the whole unresolved debate, and it all hinges on one little condition mentioned back in Deuteronomy 12, the question of rest.
Okay, so the law says it only applies after God has given Israel rest from all your enemies. But the million-dollar question is, when did that actually happen? Well, one side argues that this rest didn't really happen until the time of David and Solomon. If that's true, it would make all those earlier altars perfectly legal. But the counterargument points to the book of Joshua, which says God gave them rest right after the conquest. And if that's the case, the law should have been in effect all along, which creates a huge problem.
And that's why this isn't just some dusty old academic debate. It's really about the very foundation of how you read the Old Testament. Your answer to the Deuteronomy question decides whether you see the law as the beginning of the story or the end result, and whether the prophets were calling people back to an old foundation or building something brand new.
So in the end, this whole Deuteronomy debate leaves us with a massive question that goes way beyond just this one book. Does history shape a sacred text, reflecting the changing beliefs and politics of its day? Or does a sacred text shape its own history, setting a standard that all of that history is supposed to be judged by? That's the puzzle at the heart of it all, and it's one that scholars are still grappling with today.